We're going to go back to politics for a moment, and there is a new Quinnipiac poll that shows Texas Governor Rick Perry leading the pack among the 2012 GOP candidates. I'm sure you heard about it. But can we expect this to be short-lived is the question. Can Congressman Ron Paul take over the lead? Let's get the latest from his campaign senior advisor, Bruce Fine. Hello, Bruce. Good to see you on this Thursday morning here on the East Coast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, I got to tell you something, Bruce. I want to hear how you think Ron Paul, Congressman Paul, can jump ahead of where he is currently, because right now it's kind of a two-horse race. The names you hear, it's Perry and Romney. So how do you get your guy back to the top of the list there?
Well, I think is that Congressman Paul, presidential candidate Paul, has distinctive policies that separate him from everyone else. For example, he believes that we should spend millions for defense, not 1 cent for empire. We spend more in 1 month in Afghanistan than we spent when returning all of the victims of Hurricane Irene back to where they were. So he's in favor of defense, not permanent empire. And he understands that those who claim they're for limited government and yet want to fight wars around the world that end up costing exorbitant sums and end up making us less safe because we end regimes that are less friendly than otherwise is simply a contradiction in terms. And he's the only one who really respects the limited government in the realm of privacy. He doesn't believe the president can hold American citizens as enemy combatants without accusation or trial. He doesn't believe that we should be spying on Americans, as happens now, on so-called assessments by the FBI, because the FBI thinks in the future you might turn to criminality or terrorism. He doesn't believe that the president has power unilaterally to put U.S. citizens on assassination lists or go to war unilaterally, and flouting the Constitution with regard to the requirement that Congress authorize the initiation of warfare. And he also uniquely wants to return our social welfare programs to what they intended to be at the outset, safety net programs. We could save perhaps as much as $1 trillion a year if we made them safety nets rather than money that oftentimes goes out to those who don't need it.
And then how do you do that, Mr. Fine? How do you do that? Return it to what it was supposed to be?
You have a transition that honors past promises, but going forward, you confine eligibility for these programs to those who clearly show that they're destitute, they're in need. And just think of Ron Paul as the first one who was criticizing the Federal Reserve Board and the Board of Governors. Do you know in 2008, the Federal Reserve Board lent $16 trillion. These lends to the rich to take from the frugal and the poor. And $3 trillion of that was sent to foreign governments, foreign banks. Staggering sums, and Ron Paul was the first one on the beat to recognize this. And so he's the only candidate on the Republican side who's consistent. I want limited government. I want frugal government. I want to defend the United States. It's not our business to defend the freedom of people who are living thousands of miles away, have no allegiance to the United States, and regularly boomerang like they did with getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and we end up with Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And that's in train what's going to happen in Libya, where we already see the Transitional National Council saying Islam is the state religion, no law can be enacted contrary to Islam.
If I may jump in there, listen, I understand that Congressman Paul, candidate Paul, has a list of concerns, a list of items on his agenda that he would fix. And so, you know, you gave me a pretty good sample, a sample of that long list. But I have to say this, that the American people want to hear specifics, mainly in terms of the economy. That's what they want to hear, first and foremost. And how can Congressman Paul fix the economy and get folks back to work?
Absolutely right. An excellent question. And the way you do that is get the government to stop declaring war on jobs with all the excessive regulation. And remember, when the government is borrowing all the money, it crowds out all the money available for the private entrepreneur. So he's eager to help the small businessman.
Okay, loosen regulations in which areas?
With regard to the requirements when you're creating a company, you're trying to raise money, that the SEC requires with this new law, all these very burdensome obligations of disclosure. You have to have lawyers to do everything, and that's also true with regard to a whole host of laws that are greatly excessive and require expensive lawyers in Washington, D.C. When it relates to health and safety, these areas ought to be handled at the state level. We don't want to go back to the law of the jungle, but we need to decentralize on that score, and that would give the vibrations that you need to the economy. And remember this, at the state level, if one state does something foolish and silly, then businesses and people migrate to another state. There's immediate feedback. That's happened with regard to many states that didn't have any limits on malpractice damage awards and punitive damages. The doctor said, we're not going to work here anymore unless you put a limit on it. And so states responded. That doesn't happen at the federal level, because when they do something foolish by Congress, it affects everybody equally, so that feedback simply gets muffled. And that's a huge important element. And lastly, remember this, if the federal government is not spending and taxing all that money, it leaves that in the hands of private individuals. That creates the demands that will produce the jobs. If we think of those up and running companies like Google and like Facebook and like Microsoft, they create tens of thousands, millions of jobs. Does the federal government create jobs? No. And a good example is today's paper, where the federal government spent $500 million supposedly subsidizing a company that's going to build the new green technology, solar cells and all that, and we've gone bankrupt. $500 million created no jobs at all.
My final question for you, Mr. Fine, again, I fully and completely understand, and you as well as Congressman Paul are very passionate about all these points. But listen, in 6 days there's going to be a very important presidential debate. Succinctly, what, in your opinion, does Congressman Paul have to do in order to get his message across clearly amongst the chatter that's going to be there on that stage?
Well, I think the important point is to stress that he is different than all other candidates on these points. Right to privacy, a frugal government, limited government. You can't have that with wars and spending billions of dollars daily on fool's errands. Lift the hand of government. Stop the wars abroad. Stop the wars against jobs at home. And he is distinct on that score. And he understands that people themselves, given the freedom, will create the jobs. It's a myth to think that the government has these great, wise economists who are sitting around calculating, well, where is the new industries going to emerge? You think that it was a government official who thought about Google, who thought about Facebook? Heck no. They don't think about those. They think about the sunset industries, and then we end up building huge white elephants and then write them off. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, hundreds of billions of dollars in losses.
All righty. I'm afraid I'm out of time. Mr. Fine, Bruce Fine, Senior Advisor to Congressman Ron Paul, thank you very much for your time. And we'll be watching the debate next week, and then there's one that's happening. Thank you, sir.